All right, so welcome Marek Oziewicz to the podcast. And my first question for you is about justice. If I'm looking at this right, your most recent book is about justice in young adult literature. What drew you to that topic? And could you say a little bit about how you see Pullman's work perhaps fitting into that general area?
Wesley, that's a great question, but it's in fact not a single question. It's a whole bucket of questions here, really about justice and what drew me to justice. But okay, and Pullman, yeah, you could say that justice is one of these themes that runs as an undercurrent in much literature, in much philosophical reflection, in political reflection, are thinking about economy, about education, about so many areas of life and areas that make life meaningful are informed by our assumptions and dreams of justice. For me personally, my entrance into this area was that I grew up in communist Poland. I was 19 when communism collapsed, and I was 11 when Solidarity was created. And my dad was an active member of Solidarity. He would be arrested for a day or 2 days. He would disappear for a week, and then we would find that, oh, he's in prison now, and, are they going to let him go or not? So, that was my childhood. And now looking back, I know it was rather unusual. But at that point, when you're 11 and 12, you kind of, that's my dad. These are, cops again, going through my room and are, turning the apartment upside down and looking for these illegal anti-communist pamphlets, prints, pretty much like, I don't know, The Man in the High Castle, but in the 1980s setting in communist Eastern Europe. So that was kind of my life. But when I was, I think 14, a secret police agent going through my room, he picked up a copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and he was so disgusted by the fact that I read books like these. And so I don't remember his face, I don't remember the details of the situation, but I was very profoundly moved by his emotional reaction to the book, as if it were like he would probably have preferred to have found a bomb. But the book, it was even worse. And it sort of registered in my mind as this very formative emotional experience. And only years later did I understand that his disgust and he was appalled by the book because he kind of knew that books carry ideas that are extremely difficult to control. Once an idea takes hold in your mind, takes roots, it's beyond anyone's control, and especially in totalitarian regimes and systems where controlling how people and what people think is the key to the success of the regime. Books are extremely dangerous. So I guess that was my first entry into this thinking about justice. And over 20 years later or more, I somehow, looking back at my readings, especially speculative fiction, so fantasy, science fiction, a little bit of horror, a little bit of post-apocalyptic fiction, dystopia, kind of realized that this dream of justice is this very powerful theme in so much of this literature. Then I started thinking, okay, what is justice? Who defines justice? Justice for whom? Justice by whom? And so I kind of tried to, in this book, this is pretty much my cognitive archaeology of the concept of justice, because justice is a concept, and like other abstract concepts, it exists in language. We create structures that contain the content we call justice, embedded in stories. So that was my attempt to look at what are the types of justice, how justice is, how justice can infect young people's minds through the activity of reading, and I think it was okay. I would probably add a couple of other things now looking back, but I think it was an important step on my journey in terms of thinking about justice.
And how did you become acquainted with Pullman's work and start to kind of weave those themes together? Um, was it in the course of your reading sort of for fun, or was it in the course of your professional reading that you first became aware of Pullman's work, The Golden Compass?
The Golden Compass, I think I read the first book when it was, the European title was Northern Lights. And that's what I read when it came out. So it must have been like, I don't know when it came out, 99, right? Was it 99 or 97 maybe?
I'm not sure about the European translations. That's probably about right. Yeah.
Yeah, so I read it immediately after it appeared. And I think this was by word of mouth. So this was reading for fun rather than for my professional, for my teaching, even though I would later teach Pullman in a number of courses. But so Pullman was incredibly, when I read the first book, then I, with this anticipation, waiting for the second one and the third one. So that was really amazing. One of the most powerful fantasy works of of pretty much the 20th century, I would say. And definitely something that when it appeared completely stood out from everything else out there. And Pullman pretty much established his own tradition, which so far I think has been still pretty much his own. I mean, maybe Robert Holstock, maybe there was a couple of other authors of fantasy, but then Holstock didn't write for young readers. Holstock wrote fantasy for adults, especially his Mythago would, or adults or / young adults. But that was like a different kind of audience than Pullman. But Pullman was amazing. So his storytelling, absolutely brilliant. The concepts he introduces into the narrative, this whole conceit. So not only alternative worlds, but this key concept in the series, which is the demon. So human body and demon. This is so brilliant, so brilliant. And also the use he puts it to. So this contesting the very idea of religious, as maybe not religion per se as Catholicism specifically, or maybe monotheistic religions in general. At this point, I think that maybe he wasn't sure what he was doing at that point. So sort of was being pulled in a number of directions. And but this gives the books this sort of exploratory nature. They're open-ended. So there are moments where it seems like the author himself isn't sure where the story is taking him. And in many ways, the story took Pullman into areas that he probably didn't anticipate, nor was he comfortable exploring these areas. But that's the power of a great story.
Yeah, I like the description of it as an exploration. And what you said also about incorporating his books into your classes. I'm curious, what would you recommend reading alongside of Pullman, or how would you construct a course around a deep exploration of Pullman's works and themes? What sorts of other literature would come to mind? You mentioned one author who I'm not familiar with, but the Mythago series?
Mythago series by Robert Holstock, a British author.
Okay.
Robert Holstock. I don't know. I mean, Pullman, because this series is so amazingly innovative, and it's so packed with all kinds of themes, references, that it depends, you can use it for a number of courses, for a number of issues in terms of literature, for example, so Greek literature as a dialogue with literature that was before it. Pullman is a wonderful, wonderful example of dialoguing with past traditions. So he's dialoguing with Milton, he's dialoguing with Blake, he's dialoguing with the entire Western Christian tradition, with the Bible in the first place, of course. So, I mean, this is an amazing illustration of the power of a good story to engage and transform and open your eyes on what you thought you knew, the entire tradition of civilizational literature. I mean, so pretty amazing. So in this sense, but also the power of fantasy, which still, especially in the Anglo-American world, is burdened with this sort of negative, all kinds of negative associations, escapism, cheap thrills, inability to confront reality, all of those, really negative associations with fantasy. And Pullman himself, interestingly, is also, or was maybe, a victim of these prejudices, which came out when for many years he would claim that, no, I don't write fantasy. And it took him maybe 15 years to admit, you know what, I actually write fantasy and I'm good doing this. And so that was one of his sort of dark sides and prejudices that he inherited as a member of a given a culture, and also as an agnostic or atheist, because Pullman sort of tended to assume at some point that if you write fantasy, you gotta be a religious person. So fantasy and religion go hand in hand. They're the same kind of, or two sides of this mistaken belief about nature, or cluster of mistaken beliefs about the nature of reality and human beings and whatnot. So that, I mean, like the list of uses, how and why would you read these books, is like, sky is the limit. I mean, these books work so wonderfully, like the question of technology, the question of meaning, the questions about all kinds of philosophical questions about the nature of reality, about human curiosity. What is the nature of human curiosity? Is curiosity good or bad? What is it good for? What is it dangerous in, in what kind of situation? I mean, it's like, oh my goodness, it's a coming of age story in so many ways. It's a story about the relationship of human beings to non-human persons also. So this whole idea, because a lot of Western literature is based on, pretty much literature is our myopic and anthropocentric small cabinet of mirrors in which we look at ourselves from different angles, but it's only about humans. And one of the advantages of fantasy, and this is also something that Pullman stumbles into in this book, is that it opens our eyes that, well, no, this planet or this universe was not created specifically to put you here after gazillions of years. So there's a preparation for me, parading around. No, sorry, there are like thousands of other beings, and they have their own reasons for being here. And realizing that multiplicity, diversity, and these relationships across space and time is one of the most wonderful things that literature does. And Pullman also succeeds here.
I'm curious about that in connection with the original question about justice then. Is it primarily a learning about other new ideas, sort of history you mentioned, and literature, and maybe biology or ecology, sort of other concepts like that? Or is it primarily a work of imaginative growth and seeing things in a new way, if that makes sense? Is that a fair distinction to make? Do you think that in teaching people about justice, you would privilege or give primacy to one or other of those options? This is to explode the question even bigger, but like, is education about developing people's imagination, which seems to be what fantasy primarily does? Or is education really more about learning content and techniques for specific, content? Yeah.
No, content is too easy. Content used to be the thing about in education, but it's becoming increasingly irrelevant because computers have overtaken us in terms of storing content and even sorting content. So we're standing at the dawn of artificial intelligence, and we within our lifetime we will see probably implants or maybe some other technologies that will help you store content, but it's so much more difficult to so of course we know that a lot of knowledge has been sort of relegated outside of your head. You don't need to remember 100 phone numbers. Your phone remembers 10,000, no sweat. So I mean, you're not wasting your precious intellectual energy on remembering phone numbers. The same thing with content. So content is pretty much, I mean, it's important to know facts and content. This is important, but the modes in which we store it and access it have changed tremendously. However, the skill of filtering content and making connections among content and filtering what is relevant, what is less relevant, what is central to this argument, what is central to that argument, seeing different points of view, how the same fact matters, is far more important in this context, but less important in that context, you know, those kinds of connections. This is intelligence. And in terms of this intelligence, artificial intelligence is lagging behind us, like behind human beings by centuries. I don't know, I mean, some people in AI believe that we will never reach that kind of intelligence. And I mean, artificial intelligence in terms of making these connections, like thinking metaphorically, making these big, you know, thinking analogically and so forth. I mean, it's amazing. But coming back to your question, I think that the power of great stories, so thinking about literature, is that they do all of those things and way more than we realize at the same time. So we, you know, what we process in terms of when we read a story, our ideas, connections, associations, is only a very narrow band of what actually happens to us when we read. And there are actually theories about the importance of forgetting. That it's just as we assume that when you read a book, the important thing is that you remember what you read. But it turns out that forgetting what you read, it's even, you know, then you have, it's just as important for the formation of your knowledge and building and of another, you know, building block of your understanding. And that's why when you have 5 people reading the same novel, these 5 people will remember it differently. And that's why when you come together and you discuss it, someone mentions this episode or this quote, or someone said this and that in this context, and only then you remember, oh yeah, really, it did happen. I had no idea. So, you know, these processes are largely subliminal in terms of we've been trying to figure out what literary understanding is, or what narrative understanding is. How come we understand, how do we understand a story? And it's, so we're sort of making headway in with that, but a lot of how these processes work for individuals. So we can talk in sort of general terms, cognitive processes that happen in pretty much every single reader. But then within these processes, in terms of content, connections, associations, and meanings, these processes are so individual, they're organic in many ways, very difficult to trace, to sort of describe in this prescriptive way. So you can only describe them looking backward, and they apply to an individual reader's understanding rather to, you know, a sort of a generalized statement that applies to everyone. So what I would say, yes, we learn. We're not always sure how we learn, nor are we sure what exactly it is that we learn through reading stories. But the power of great stories is that they are, in cognitive science, they call them multiply indexable knowledge structures. So it's like a bundle which has 1,001 different strings through which you pull it and it opens into something. And then you close it again and you pull it through another string and it opens into an elephant. And then you pull it, so you can, you know, you can do with the same story an amazing array of uses.
Yeah.
Because it has so many of these like entryways. So that's one idea.
Yeah, that's very interesting with respect to Pullman's sort of materialism, which is an interesting form of it, right? Because you have this being which is connected to you, your demon, right? Mm-hmm. Which is not entirely physical the way that the person's body is physical. It seems that it bears some relation to them because as they grow, it changes and their relationship to it changes. And I wonder about what you're describing as sort of the cognitive processes that are going on. Do you have a sense of whether, it sounds like we don't understand them well enough to reproduce them digitally or technologically. Do we have a grasp on what material processes or chemical processes are going on there? What sorts of, if you can speak a little bit about the neurological component of this, or the biological component of this. What do we know about that, and how far can our understanding of those processes go, does it seem?
We know quite a lot. I won't be able to give you specific quotes, but in terms of the description of like physical, biological, neurochemical reactions, we have these descriptions of what happens when people read, what areas of mind lit up, but frankly, they're pretty boring. They're very technical. It's like, when you look at this wonderful meal that you're about to eat and someone breaks it down into calories, fiber, this and that, and they give you numbers, so you have this exquisite list of facts. It's so untasty, and no matter how detailed this list is, it really doesn't tell you anything about the experience of eating this meal, right? So we have these descriptions, and one of my big questions that I'm struggling with is that, yes, cognitive science is a great tool to describe some of the mechanisms, especially subliminal mechanisms that happen when we read. But at the same time, the more detailed you get about this description, the more it turns it into a very technical, this technical language which dries out the description, like punches a hole in what we're talking about, which is the experience of reading and the transformation of our thinking. And thoughts are not necessarily material things. We don't know. I mean, we know that if you damage certain part of the brain, then certain connections don't happen, like depth, your vision changes, or maybe short-term memory disappears. So we know, but so this is a good analogy, but also, I mean, if you damage the screen of your computer, it doesn't mean that, YouTube is not streaming. It's just not streaming on your screen, so it's there somewhere. But so we know that hardware and software are just as important. You need to have the physical gooey brain to think about love and meals, but love and meals and everything else in philosophy is way beyond this gooey cauliflower substance that you carry in your skull, in your cranium. So there are descriptions, and there's an entire subfield of developmental psychology, for example, that deals with these cognitive structures, cognitive development, and so forth. And it's important. I find it interesting, but I also am aware of its limitations, that it's not the holy grail. Oh, finally we got it. We know what happens when you read. Well, we know what areas of your brain lit up or not, but we need a different way of talking about the quality of this experience, and the question of how reading or encounter with art is transformative, like personally transformative. That's a whole different issue, for which we're still struggling after, 3,000-4,000 years. We're still struggling to find words to describe it. We just, it's not that it's a mysterious spiritual process, but we haven't come to this full articulation of what happens, how it works exactly. There are just so many factors at play.
Yes, the last thing, if you could just say a brief bit about your description of these kinds of fantasies as mythopoeic fantasies.
Yeah.
Is that maybe a way of getting at a more holistic picture of the human experience, of this transmission of stories and what they do to transform our experience? Mythopoeic is a word that is derived from Tolkien, is that right? How are you using
Lewis invented it, but then he applied it to Tolkien's writing, and Tolkien himself spoke about his aspiration to create a new myth. And the whole idea of this new myth is, and that's why mythopoeic, the word is that something looks like myth or feels like myth. And the thinking behind this concept is that we are always aware of how we inhabit our bodies. Like you close your eyes, maybe when you're in deep sleep, you don't feel it, but otherwise you really feel like the ending of your body, your fingers, you know, when you touch something, you have a sense of your boundaries, how you live in your body. Even if you close your eyes, you also have a sense of how we inhabit physical space. Like, you know that you're in a room, even if there is a wall in front of you, you know there is something behind this wall and so forth. So like we have the sense of being in space. But very few people are consciously aware of how profoundly we inhabit language. We are creatures of language. We think that language is here or there, but we actually move in spaces of language like a gecko moves within the space of terrarium without being aware that it lives in a terrarium. So, and you know, a language, if you don't have terms for something, if you don't have words, if you are unable to articulate concepts or experiences through words, you are unable to objectify them, to see them, and to do things with them. I mean, a language is actually like a tool, like a hand. You have a hand, you do things, you know, through your hands, you handle tools. It's in the same way we handle reality through language. And myth is one of those terms that has been used as this umbrella concept for the structures of language that we're not aware that they define us. And in myth, of course, very specifically, myth has been used for traditional stories. Societies tell themselves about important things, including gods, but not necessarily, not only. But in this larger sense, myth would be a structure of beliefs that you are probably born into or maybe acculturated through your upbringing. So these are the ideas that seem natural to you, behind which we like are absolutely, like, this is our wall, conceptual wall. We cannot imagine anything beyond it. And for example, capitalism in this sense is a myth. We seem to be unable to imagine any way that a society can be organized other than along capitalist lines. And religions, most religions also function as myth systems because they are predicated on a set of beliefs that, like, if any of these beliefs disappear, then the meaning of your existence collapses. So that was one of those arguments that Pullman attacks, for example. So the argument would be, if there is no God, there is no morality. If there is no morality, life sucks. And, you know, it's unrewarding. So Pullman says, well, duh, yes, there is morality. You can be a great person without believing in God, and you don't need religion to tell you what things are good, what things are bad in life. You know, you can figure it out yourself. So that is how he challenges and sort of punctures this, you know, the myth of religion, and especially revealed religion. That is sort of very pyramidal and comes like authorities top down. You know, someone above you knows more and they tell you, and then you say, oh, sure, I will do that. So, you know, he says, no, we don't need that kind of structure.
Yeah, I really appreciate, I know we are going a little over time here, so I'll let you go.
I still have a few more minutes because my son was supposed to be here at 5, but he's not. So and I need to leave 1:15. So we still have about 10 minutes.
So yeah, the thing that I would then come back to with the idea of Pullman dismantling a kind of existing myth or his interpretation of that myth, I feel that he's also attempting to put forth his own, right, construct his own, and he might not yet have a fully worked out notion of what that is, but in the course of the story, you get sort of hints of that. The demon is a big one, but also dust, right? This sort of mysterious, again, material and yet not easily pinned down or reduced to our concept of material. Do you have a sense that the kind of consciousness and curiosity that seems to be represented in dust, does it line up kind of with, or bridge maybe the mythic understanding and the more scientific, rational, like what's lighting up in the brain sort of understanding? Does that seem like a metaphor that can be, I don't know, be something like the measurements that we're becoming able to do, or is it more of a mythic, a creative or imaginative representation of human experience?
Well, time will show. In 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when we have more advanced systems of artificial intelligence, or once we develop super intelligence, maybe super intelligence will be, or the Internet of Things will be this kind of dust that crystallizes consciousness, that reaches certain threshold of crystallization through objects, and then has intentions and can communicate with other intentional agents. So that's possible. I remember that when I first read these books, that the idea of dust was such a wonderful bridge, I thought, between our scientific and spiritual understanding, maybe more on the sort of scientific leg here. But my guess is that within the next 20, 50 years, when someone reads Pullman, looking back, this might seem so sort of quaint, old, dated, and super fantasy, like flying backpacks in the 50s, which people thought, oh my gosh, that's the future. It's now science fiction, but it's going to be the future, or blasters, those kinds of things. So I think that Pullman is far more an inheritor of these fantastic modes of thinking, rather than current scientific, even though I think he would vehemently oppose and he would say, no, I'm 100% science. I speak the language of science, which is probably true to an extent, I would say. But this concept of dust that permeates and exists everywhere throughout the entire universe, all levels and multiverses, levels of existence and multiverses. This is pretty much Pullman's return, probably unconscious, to the idea of maybe either ether, maybe not ether, but ether, because ether was thought of as a space, but this animist consciousness, which we know from beliefs of so many cultures on this planet. Animism meaning the belief that everything is alive, although on different levels of what it means to be alive, and on different levels of consciousness. So rocks are alive and they're conscious, but they're conscious in different ways than a plant is or a human being. So you could make a strong argument, I think, that Pullman inadvertently resurrects the concept of animistic perception of the world, which he uses as a weapon against structured, hierarchical, revealed religion. But it is certainly a wonderfully realized concept in these books. Yes.
Yeah, and it seems like it's one that he's continuing to explore, even as he's writing his new trilogy that's coming out. The next one should be coming out pretty soon, actually. The way that he promotes conscious thought and sort of gets into the idea that there's intelligences out there which we can communicate with, which are different from our own or on sort of a different level than our own, is, I think, one that is partly from his experience of writing stories, from being a creative artist, right? That's sort of the sense that he seems to describe what writing feels like to him, is like the narrator or the story itself sort of taking shape or having a kind of personality to it. And I wonder how much of that is something that he intuits, and how much of it is something that he has also sort of absorbed from other authors like Lewis, who speaks in a very similar manner.
This connection, I think, would be, at least used to be, quite disturbing for Pullman to recognize that he might be operating as an author in very much the same way that authors whose work he deplores and hates, Lewis or Tolkien or other fantasists. So, but I think you're right. This is a great point, that Pullman is, it's not just pure invention, what he's thinking about does, that in many ways it does seem to reflect his experience as a creative author, writer, who knows what it means to be inspired. He knows that there are these moments where the story comes to you, invites you, pulls you in, and you're pretty much recording, like taking dictation. I mean, and this is a process that many authors, poets, visionaries, artists have experienced in whatever the area in which they work is. So I'm pretty sure that Pullman is building on that experience, and at the same time, he also offers especially his recent book offers a great example of how our brains work. And there is a book. Okay, I gotta open the door to my son who's outside of my office. I will lead him in and get back. Okay, just give me a minute. Be right back. Wesley. And this brings me to a book which I don't remember the title, and I don't have it in my office now, but it's a book by Australian psychotherapist and author. His name is Hugh Crago, and the title of the book is, okay, it's there, but I can't recall it. But so he pretty much, Entranced by Story. Okay, Entranced by Story. That's the title of the book. So Crago wrote this book based on his, I think, over 30 years of experience as a therapist, storyteller, and his thesis in this book, the argument he builds, is that our minds work on the software of stories, but depending on our age, so it's not the age of the mind, so it's physical age, but also life experience is sort of, I mean, these boundaries are blurred, but he pretty much says that in different stages of our lives, our brains are drawn to very specific types of stories. Sometimes endings are extremely important, but not beginnings. Sometimes the middle part is important, but not the beginning or the ending. Then themes differ, and all kinds of absolutely fascinating, brilliant argument of how the two hemispheres are in this dialogue and how they are, one or the other like takes the upper hand, and they help us create and enjoy specific types of stories at different stages of our life. So I think that many of the claims that Crago makes in these books are wonderful illustrations of what Pullman has done as an author with his fiction, allowing there are moments in these books when he is so extremely rational, very much left hemispheric. Then suddenly there is a switch and you have a right hemispheric narration, which is mythical, complex, organic, so you cannot break it into these separate strands or parts. And this recent book, La Belle Sauvage, which Pullman wrote, I think, over close to 20 years after writing the first ones. I mean, I can tell the difference. He's a different person, different narrator in this book than in the first three. So even seeing this shift and how in La Belle Sauvage, his interest is slightly different than in the first three books, it's another interesting case in point to a discussion of how our minds create stories, because our minds are hardwares that run this software called the story.
Gosh, yeah, that gives me a lot of material to process and to continue reading. Again, thank you very much, Marek,
Sure.
for your time. And I hope that we keep in touch, and that you find some time to keep going with your writing projects and research and everything. And I wish you the best. Thanks again.
Thanks, Wesley. I appreciate it. Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you. I thought that the questions you asked were brilliant. These are really deep, penetrating questions. And I keep my fingers crossed that you explore Pullman's work and other work, and let me know how it goes.
All right.
And whenever you're ready to post this conversation, also send me a link. I'll be interested to check it out.
Okay.
And yeah, let's keep in touch.
Thank you very much. Have a good one.
All right. Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
Again, many thanks, Dr. Marek Oziewicz, for taking the time to talk to me. That was back in November, actually, but I've had a number of guests since then who are speaking with me about specific parts of the book, so I had to post those in between. So sorry for the delay, but I hope you enjoyed it. A little more about Marek. He teaches at the University of Minnesota, professor in literacy education, the Sidney and Margaret Henry Professor of Children's and Young Adult Literature. His interests include studying the nature of people as storytellers and story hearers, the role of justice and ethics, global consciousness, environmental awareness, and well, you can see for yourself on his webpage. I'll post a link to it in the description and on the course page. Really impressive. His recent book, One Earth, One People, won the 2010 Mythopoeic Scholarship Award in Myth and Fantasy Studies. His recent book, Justice in Young Adult Speculative Fiction, it goes more into detail about the topic of justice, as I think we discussed in that talk. Anyway, thanks again, Dr. Oziewicz. And with the remainder of the time here, I wanted to just mention in passing that more reviews are up from the Historic Materials Illuminated essays. Those are up on the blog. I'll keep on reading around in Pullman, his critics, his admirers, things that he recommends reading and things that he's clearly read, and continue to broaden the field of research for this project. All of that will be posted on the blog, and I'll try to link to it from time to time in the descriptions here. I've also put up some more songs, and these will be Tiny Flowers in the Arctic, then Fencing, and finally the Tunguska Campaign. Hope you enjoy.